In terms of the presentation today, what I'd like to do is to start by providing you with an overview of the ORBIT model. And ORBIT is a phased approach to behavioral intervention development. And there are some other models that are available, although not a lot. And so I do want to talk a little bit with you about the advantages of this particular model to behavioral scientists. And then I'm going to contextualize the model a little bit because it's always hard to talk in the abstract. So what I want to do is use the work that we've done in my lab to develop a behavioral intervention to address health equity for Black youth with type 1 diabetes, to sort of talk a little bit more about that model and how it might be helpful to you. So I do want us to start, though, by considering the pharmaceutical research process. And I think that that's valuable to do, to just remind us that in this world, we have well-specified and clear phases for the drug development process. So I'm imagining that this diagram is familiar to many of you, but just to sort of point out that, again, this is a phased approach that's driven by FDA regulations in part, and to point out some differences between this process and the process that behavioral scientists use. So one thing to point out is that if you look at the left of the diagram in terms of the early basic science processes, that those who are involved in drug development are already thinking ahead to drug potency. So they're looking to develop a potent drug that's likely to work in the clinical trial stages. And unfortunately, behavioral scientists often aren't thinking that way. So we'll talk a little bit about how the ORBIT model might be an approach that thinks differently and does better with optimizing that. Another difference to point out here is that if you look here, and again, the sort of drug development model, even at the point that pharmaceutical developers move into preclinical or animal studies, they're already thinking carefully about things like the administration route for the drug and the pharmacologic profile. But again, in the behavioral science world, we're typically not thinking about things like administration route. So what might that look like? That might be, how do we deliver this intervention? Is it going to be delivered in person or by eHealth or mHealth? Who's going to deliver it? Is it going to be a clinician, like a dietitian or a physician? Is it going to be a community health worker? Again, these issues are often not considered early. Dose of an intervention is often very random. So whether it's brief or intensive is often not a well thought out process. And then I want to point out that when we move in drug development to clinical trials, again, the phases are really well specified. So the FDA defines clearly what is a phase 1 safety study, where we're looking at things like escalating dose protocols to understand the best dose and what is the side effect profile in comparison to a phase 2 efficacy study, where we're considering whether the drug works. And also, we have clearly defined milestones for moving between these phases. And again, in the behavioral science intervention development literature, those things tend to be poorly specified historically. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the ORBIT model and how this might be an improvement. So the ORBIT model, again, is a phased approach to behavioral intervention development. And this model was developed in part in our lab at Wayne State. And it was developed as part of an NIH consortium that was focused actually on optimizing obesity interventions. So the consortium overall was looking at effective weight loss interventions. But this model is naive to chronic illness or disease, so it can be used with any chronic disease. And I'll just say a little bit about the model while we look at this diagram. So on the left, you can see that similar to the drug development process, it does start with the basic behavioral science process. And we want to start by identifying a significant clinical question. And then in phase 1, we're really thinking about making sure that we identify an effective mechanism and we refine an intervention early. I'll say a little more about this in a minute. In phase 2, then, we're considering preliminary testing, proof of concept, and pilot studies. Again, I'll say more in a minute. And then we're moving into phase 3 efficacy trials and phase 4 effectiveness trials. So what are some of the advantages of the orbit model? What does it do differently that might be of use to behavioral scientists? Well, one of the things that I want to point out is it's focused on the earlier stages of the development continuum, that is phase 1 and phase 2. And so Orbit encourages researchers to start by selecting biobehavioral or social mechanisms that are likely to have a significant influence on a clinically relevant health behavior or outcome. So in Orbit, we really want early to be thinking ahead to whether the mechanism that we're focused on, let's suppose it's psychological stress, is really likely, if we intervene on it, to have a potent effect on a clinically relevant health endpoint. And typically that means something that is an important outcome in a chronic disease. And why do we care? Because the reality is that when we get to the other end of the continuum, which is the dissemination end, the funders of these interventions are only likely to fund us and disseminate our work if, in fact, we're really going to improve a clinically relevant endpoint, like improving someone's health who has a chronic disease. So we want to think about this early on. In addition, in Orbit, the model encourages us to ensure that the candidate intervention components are really a good fit for the identified behavioral mechanism of action. So again, if I'm going to be looking at improving psychological stress as a critical mechanism, that I better ensure that I pick an intervention that's likely to reduce stress. And similarly, Orbit encourages the researcher to test for signals of efficacy early in the development process. And I would just point out that with novel approaches to testing the efficacy of interventions outside the context of adequately powered clinical trials, this is really something that we can achieve. So we really do have approaches now that allow us to, for example, within a single arm clinical trial with repeated measures and using linear mixed modeling approaches, really look to see if we're getting improvements in both a relevant health behavior and a health outcome in a way that was more difficult to do in the past. Okay, so then other advantages of the Orbit model. Orbit encourages the researcher to begin with the end in mind. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the early intervention process is supposed to be guided by the end user. Now, end users could include the person who's participating, obviously, in the intervention, so the user of the intervention, but it could also include other relevant stakeholders. So, for example, if we're going to deliver the intervention in a clinic setting, we should be getting stakeholder input from the clinicians who are in that clinic early on to see if this fits with their delivery mode for healthcare. Likewise, if we're going to do it in a community agency, we should be getting that input earlier. Why? Again, because if we don't consider those kind of issues early on, we may develop an intervention that's never going to be disseminated. And that's something that certainly has been a problem for me in some of my work. And so I think this is something we really need to consider. Again, beginning with the end in mind, we want to think about factors such as treatment dose and delivery method early in the process. And finally, Orbit specifies milestones for transitions between the phases in this behavioral model. So how do we know that our intervention is ready to transition to testing, for example, in our phase 3 efficacy trial? Okay, so I've talked at a very high level now. So what I'd like to do at this point is talk very specifically about our work and how we used Orbit to actually develop our intervention. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit first about type 1 diabetes, because in order to understand the work that we've done, I think it would be helpful for me to talk a little bit about this chronic condition, make sure that we're all on the same page about what it is and how it's managed. So type 1 diabetes is different than type 2. It's characterized by a failure of the pancreatic islet cells. So persons with type 1 diabetes do have to take insulin on a daily basis. Unlike type 2, which is a disease of insulin resistance, you can't just take medications that help you metabolize the insulin that you're producing, because you're not producing any insulin. So it does require a complex medical management regimen. So again, that includes multiple insulin injections per day, or in the new world of type 1 diabetes management, you wear an insulin pump on your body that infuses insulin into your body on a continuous basis. People with type 1 need to monitor their blood glucose levels throughout the day. So again, the old way would be that you prick your finger with a lancet, you stick a drop of blood on a strip and you stick it in a meter. In the new world, you can wear a continuous glucose monitor that is looking at your blood glucose level throughout the day. And you all may have heard about CGMs because they're being advertised on TV pretty widely, because now they're being used also by people with type 2 diabetes. And then finally, another and critical component of management is dietary management. So people with type 1 diabetes need to pay careful attention to their carbohydrate intake, because carbohydrates are broken down to glucose in the bloodstream, and that affects highs and lows in blood sugars. So you can see there's a lot to do. Our research is focused on children with type 1. This is actually the most common point at which diabetes is diagnosed, although type 1 can be diagnosed in adults. The most common age of diagnosis for children is about 6 or 7 years of age. So given that, you can imagine that initially it is the parent who is really managing the disease. But as children grow and are in the adolescent period, we obviously want to slowly transition diabetes management to the adolescent, because the long-term goal, of course, is that they're able to independently manage their care. So here, the take-home message is that youth or adolescents require a lot of parental support to help manage their care. So family management is critical. There is a substantial body of literature that connects suboptimal illness management to chronically high blood glucose levels. So if you do not care for your diabetes well, your blood sugars are going to run high, and in turn, that results in the long-term in diabetes complications. So in the world of behavioral intervention research, when it comes to children with type 1 diabetes, one of the problems is that there is a lack of evidence-based behavioral interventions that improve glycemic control. So we actually have a lot of interventions that have been developed, and most of those have been shown to have some impact on an intermediary health outcome, or health behavior, excuse me, like illness management or stress or diabetes distress. But despite that, most of these have not been shown to improve glycemic control. So now let's talk a little bit about youth of color with type 1 diabetes, and what do we know about youth of color. Well, one thing to point out is that white youth have been the focus of most of the type 1 diabetes research, whether it is biomedical or behavioral, and that's because most youth are white, and so there's been a lack of focus on youth of color with type 1. On the other hand, there is 20 years of descriptive and epidemiological data that says that Hispanic and Black children are significantly more likely to have suboptimal glycemic control. And that means that their blood sugars are more likely to be running high, and they're more likely to have diabetes complications. So this is not new news. We've known this for a long time. But despite that, there are essentially no evidence-based interventions to address these health disparities. We have no interventions at all, essentially, for youth of color, and certainly nothing that is known to work. And so this is a problem that clearly needs to be addressed. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the orbit model, and we're going to start on the left side of this diagram. And what I'd like to do is talk with you about our phase 1 work first, where we worked to develop an effective intervention for Black youth with type 1 diabetes. Okay, so what is the phase 1A design phase in orbit? In orbit, in phase 1A, we are using basic science studies to identify behavioral risk factors that can serve as treatment targets to improve health in order to design the essential features of a behavioral treatment. And so in our work, we were interested in investigating the relationship between a critical parenting behavior and health outcomes in youth with type 1 diabetes. And again, I hope that makes sense to you, given what I said about the critical nature of family management for youth with type 1. Okay, and so in our work, we were interested in a parenting construct called parental monitoring. Well, what is parental monitoring? Parental monitoring is parenting behaviors that involve information seeking about a youth's daily activities and then direct supervision and oversight. So when I say parental monitoring, I want you, especially those of you with children, to think trust but verify. So basically what we're talking about here is the idea that you go to your adolescent and you say, hey, did you do your homework? And they say, yeah. And then you say, well, can I see it? And they say, right? So they didn't actually do it. So again, the same idea applies to diabetes management. When we're talking about monitoring, we're talking about actually seeing the youth complete components of their diabetes care. So we obviously did not come across this idea from just sort of out of the blue. So I'll say a little bit about what was known about the general child development literature and this construct of parental monitoring. What we knew was that low levels of monitoring are related to risky behaviors in adolescents overall. So low monitoring is related to things like early initiation of sexual activity and risky sex, problematic use of alcohol and drugs, and then poor academic outcomes. And we also knew that in the general child development literature, when thinking about youth of color or low SES youth, that parental monitoring seemed to be particularly important. So it really seemed to serve a really important protective factor, for example, in youth who are living in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So again, given our interest in Black youth, we thought that this construct might be very important. So our goal then was to determine if parental monitoring predicted illness management and health outcomes in youth with diabetes, because at the time we began, this was unknown and there were no studies. So I'm just going to share a little bit about our work in this space. We did 2 cross-sectional studies where we enrolled adolescents with type 1 diabetes and their caregivers. The first had 99 families, the second had about 270 families. And I'm showing you these demographic tables predominantly because what I want to point out is that in each of these studies, we enrolled about 35 to 40% of the sample who were Black youth. And so then we could have confidence that the findings from these studies would be generalizable to that population. Again, most studies on youth with type 1 diabetes are done with samples that are all white. So here I'm just showing you for the purposes of illustrating one of the findings from one of our studies. And in this study, we use structural equation modeling to test our hypothesis. On the left side of this diagram, I just want you to see that we have our predictor, which is a questionnaire report of parental monitoring. That's the latent construct on the left. In the middle, we have our latent construct measuring illness management, which was comprised of questionnaire self-report plus some objective measures of the youth's illness management. And on the far right, I want you to see that we then were predicting a measure called hemoglobin A1C. That's a measure of the youth's average blood glucose levels over the past 2 to 3, or over the last 2 to 3 months. And in this model, we had a nice, robust support for our hypothesis. Monitoring was significantly predictive of illness management. Illness management was significantly predictive of glycemic control. And then not shown here, but tested, was the indirect effect of monitoring on A1C, which was also significant. And so I'm just going to summarize here some of the things that we found in these phase 1 studies. Again, we did have support for the effect of parental monitoring as an important mechanism that we could focus on in intervention studies. It affected both a health behavior and a health outcome. So that's consistent with robust's requirements, or in Orbit's requirements, excuse me. We also found that parents with more depressive symptoms had lower levels of parental monitoring. So that was important to know. We looked at styles of monitoring, and we found that the most common way that parents reported that they monitored their youth was to ask them what they had done. So, did you take your insulin today? But our study showed that that kind of asking did not predict youth outcomes. Again, direct observation and watching youth do their diabetes care was the behavior that was predictive of better youth health. And finally, we found that Black youth were at higher risk for lower monitoring. So again, that supports that this may be a critical intervention point for this group of youth. Okay, so now back to Orbit. What do we need to know in terms of our milestones for transition? So again, the Orbit model has milestones for transition, which is an advantage. So in order to move to phase B, we want to have intervention targets delineated and some input that would lead us to think about what treatment components we might want to use. So what if we learned from our studies? Daily parental supervision is the key. So this tells us that we would want to use a family intervention approach. It also tells us, though, that parents need information, because remember, our study showed us that parents were often using ineffective strategies for monitoring, so that we can assume they just don't know what may be the right way to monitor. We found that depressed or stressed parents supervised less. So then maybe we want to think about a low burden approach. If we're asking stressed parents to do more, that may not work well. Also, perhaps we may need to increase motivation. So maybe depressed parents need a lot of motivation to engage in doing something different. And finally, we know that Black youth are at elevated risk. So that leads us to think about culturally tailored interventions and to carefully consider our intervention delivery approach. We know that Black families and Black adults have problems with access to healthcare, so we really need to think carefully about how we're going to deliver this intervention to this group of families. All right, okay, so here we are in phase 2B, and phase 2B in Orbit is the refine phase. So in the refine phase, we're thinking about practical aspects of the intervention, such as mode of delivery and intervention dose. So how did we do our phase 1B study? So in collaboration with caregivers of Black youth, we wanted to work collaboratively with them to develop an intervention. So we were really making sure that we considered community needs. And in particular, after developing the intervention, our phase 2B study methods included doing a beta test and revising the intervention based on feedback. So in particular, we had 5 caregivers use the intervention in our clinic setting. So this is, again, a very early kind of proof of concept study. So we weren't delivering this the way we would in the real world, but just to have them use it and give feedback so that it could be revised as needed. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the intervention first, because I think it's going to make more sense about how we conducted this phase if I describe where we ended. So this is kind of the end point, but I'm going to start with the end point. So our intervention was called the 3 M's. And I want to talk a little bit about the intervention content. So the 3 M's content, including provided parents with information about daily parental supervision. It included information about the why, so what's the reason that it's important to supervise, and the how, so what's the optimal way of supervising. And the name, the 3Ms, was actually a mnemonic that we developed with our caregiver group. And it was intended to remind parents about what they should supervise. So the 3Ms were medicine, so watching as many doses of insulin administration as possible during the day. The second M was meter or monitor. So the advice to parents was check your child's monitor each day so that you could make sure that it was being worn or used. And then the third M was meals. So the information of advice was eat at least one meal each day with your child so that you can see how they're counting carbohydrates. Another aspect of intervention content was that we included motivation building components in the intervention. And an example of a motivation building component would be a decisional balance exercise. So in decisional balance exercises, parents were asked to weigh the pros and cons of making behavior change in terms of their parenting behavior. So why would it be important to you? What are your goals and values around your child's health? And then why might it be important to you to parent them in a different way? The mode of intervention delivery was eHealth. So this intervention was delivered via an eHealth platform using a virtual avatar. And the avatar walked the parent through the intervention and was able to read components out loud, which was advantageous for a population who potentially could have low health literacy. And in terms of dose, we developed a 3-session intervention, so brief, and each session lasted approximately 10 to 15 minutes. The intervention, the eHealth intervention, was intended to be delivered on any internet-enabled device, so that could be a tablet like an iPad or a cellular device like an iPhone, or it could include a desktop computer. Okay, so again, with Black youth, we wanted to think about health equity. And so, as I mentioned, the informational content that I described was developed with primary caregivers of Black adolescents. They reviewed the language that we used in the intervention. We also worked collaboratively with Black researchers who also vetted the content and language. An example of how we worked to develop a culturally competent intervention is that some of the material was delivered through video clips. So for example, we had a Black healthcare provider who provided the initial advice on the value of daily parental supervision and the how we advised them to do the supervision. And then we also included a video clip of a Black parent who provided a testimonial on how doing daily supervision had helped her and her family and helped her help her child improve their health status. So again, that's another example of a motivation building component. One of the decisions that we had to make at this early stage with regard to health equity involved the issue of, again, how to deliver the intervention. So we had to think carefully about whether we would deliver this clinic or this intervention in a diabetes clinic setting or make it freely available to parents to use whenever they wanted. So why were we thinking about that? Well, adolescents do have to go, or they're expected to attend, diabetes clinics 3 to 4 times a year for regular diabetes care. So that's a place where a 3-session intervention could be delivered. So on the one hand, parents are going to and youth are going to clinic anyway. And we were concerned that our families might have barriers to internet access in the community, or they may lose their cell phone due to financial difficulties. So that might be an advantage to delivering this intervention in a clinic setting. But on the other hand, as we talked about before, Black families experience a lot of barriers just getting to clinic. So if our families didn't go for their medical care, then they certainly would not get this intervention. So on balance, in the end, we decided to deliver our 3Ms intervention at diabetes clinic visits and then assess the success of that in terms of access and delivery. So again, we wanted to gather data to inform our transition out of phase 1B. So I'm just sharing a little bit of the data that we collected from our 5 caregivers who engaged in our beta test. So overall, satisfaction with the content of the intervention was high. We asked them to rate how helpful it was, whether you would recommend it to another parent on a scale of 1 to 10. The ratings were mostly high, 9 to 10. And then, we also, again, asked them to rate or give us quantitative feedback on the number of sessions. So 4 of 5 said, that's good, 3 is great, or I'd like to have more. The length of the sessions, 10 to 15 minutes. Again, most of the parents said, great, this is a good length. And delivery in the clinic setting, a priori, 4 of 5 parents said, that makes sense to me. I have a lot of downtime in the clinic. It's boring there anyway, so this would be a good thing. I can use it while I'm waiting to see the doctor. I do want to share a little bit of qualitative feedback that we obtained as well from the caregivers. So we did semi-structured interviews. One of the feedback points was that the intervention conveyed the importance of parental monitoring. So I'm always on my daughter about, thinking she's doing it, meaning her diabetes care, and then she's not, or she's saying she is, and now I realize it's hard for them when they get to a certain age to maintain, meaning their diabetes care. And I'm just taking it for granted that she's doing it. And also that the intervention provided a sense of shared experience. So the idea that other parents go through the same thing, I'm not alone, and this is just something I need to think about because it may help my family. Okay, so moving along, what are the milestones in ORBIT for proceeding to phase 2? ORBIT directs us to consider whether the treatment package includes essential intervention components addressing behavioral risk factors. We felt that was met, that we had addressed the factors that we identified in our early behavioral basic science studies. It's offered in an efficient way in terms of the dose. We felt that was met. Acceptable to the population of interest. We felt that was met. Oops. And is there another metric? No, I guess that's it. Okay, so we had met those 3. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about our phase 2 study. So here we are moving into preliminary proof of concept or pilot testing. Okay, so if you care to, you can certainly do some readings about all sorts of different ways that ORBIT suggests that you can do these kind of early pilot studies. But ours was a very traditional pilot randomized clinical trial. And so I'll talk a little bit about that trial. We enrolled primary caregivers, again, of Black youth, aged 10 to 14 years of age, with type 1 diabetes. And they were randomized to one of 2 conditions, either the 3Ms, which we've already described, or an attention control condition. So we had 19 in 3Ms, 24 in attention control. And in this case, our attention control was pretty rigorous. It was delivered by eHealth. It was matched for number of sessions. So the attention control parents got 3 sessions. And the only difference was that the attention control was basically just general facts and information about diabetes. So it didn't deliver any kind of parenting or family management kinds of intervention content. So what did we find in our phase 2 pilot randomized control trial? Recruitment and retention were promising. So 71% of the eligible families enrolled, only about 17% refused. The reason that that doesn't add to 100% is because we had a subset of families who said, oh yeah, that sounds great. Oh yeah, that sounds great, but never actually enrolled in the clinical trial. 94% of the enrolled families completed the study, so retention rates were good. So in terms of assessing outcomes, because this is a pilot clinical trial and we are in no way adequately powered, what we did to test efficacy was basically to conduct paired t-tests. So we compared the data at baseline to outcomes at 6-month post-test, at which point the families had completed the 3 sessions. And so within the intervention arm, what we saw in terms of signals of efficacy was a trend to significant increase in parent-reported daily direct supervision of adolescent diabetes management, which is, again, the mechanism that we're targeting. And we also had a trend to significant improvement in hemoglobin A1C, which again is blood glucose levels over the past 2 to 3 months. I'll also note, and again, this is important from the consideration of the orbit standpoint about what is a signal of efficacy, that from the broader literature in type 1 diabetes, we know that a decrease in A1C of 0.5% is clinically meaningful and tied to reductions in long-term diabetes complications. So in our study, we had a trend to statistical significance, but we also had a mean decrease in A1C of 0.6%, which means it was also clinically meaningful. If you like to think in effect sizes, the effect size for the decrease was moderate, so 0.42. Conversely, the control arm showed no change in any of these relevant endpoints, so basically nothing was happening in the control arm. So again, in terms of orbit milestones for proceeding to phase 3, our study findings indicated that feasible recruitment and retention was shown. We did not have, Orbit would like us to consider whether we had any evidence of differential attrition out of the arms. We did not. The retention rates were similar in the two arms. That the intervention produces a clinically meaningful signal on both the behavioral risk factor, which in our case was parental monitoring and direct supervision in particular, and also the health outcome, which in our case was glycemic control. And finally, that there's no evidence that there's any change in the control condition, which we did not have. So we felt that we had met those milestones, and so we proceeded on to phase 3, which is our adequately powered efficacy trial. So here we are in phase 3, and I will talk with you a little bit about what happened in our phase 3 study. So we've just completed this work. This data is hot off the press. The study was a randomized multi-center clinical trial in order to enroll an adequate sample of Black youth with type 1 in this very tight age range. We had to enroll at 7 clinics. So we enrolled at 4 pediatric diabetes clinics in Chicago and 3 in Detroit. And in the study, unlike the last study where we looked in comparison to an attention control, the 3 M's was compared to standard medical care. And that is typically the advice in the orbit model, that once we feel we have a robust signal in a pilot, that we can move to a study where we're comparing to standard medical care. So again, our eligibility were similar to what we had used in the past. We were enrolling young adolescents. We wanted, of course, a primary caregiver who was willing to participate in the intervention, and the family had to self-identify as Black. Again, in this study, the intervention, that is the 3 M's, was delivered in the clinic setting. It was delivered over 12 months because, again, in that window, youth would be expected to be in clinic 3 to 4 times and could, in principle, receive the intervention. And in this study, just like our pilot, the intervention was delivered by research staff. So again, we handed the youth, the parent, an iPad when they were in the diabetes clinic. And we collected data at baseline, 6 months, which would be midpoint in the intervention development window, 12 months, and then 18 months, which would be 6 months after potential completion of all intervention sessions. Sample demographics, we enrolled 149 youth. The median family income was $25,000. So again, you can see this is a very low income sample. Mean A1C was 11.5%. American Diabetes Association standards recommend that A1C should be at 7.5% or lower. So you can see our sample was absolutely in suboptimal control and had elevated blood glucose levels. Average age about 13. Most of these youth had had diabetes for quite a while, which we would expect given the typical age of onset. And in the study, As in our pilot, recruitment rates were high, a little lower than we reported in our pilot, but still only 27% of the families we approached declined to participate, which again suggests that on the face of it, the intervention was of interest to families to participate in. So what did we find? And here I'm showing you the intervention effects on the primary endpoint, which again were hemoglobin A1C. At the top in the dotted line is our control condition. Below in black in the dark line is, in the dotted top line is our control, and the black dark line is our intervention, the 3 M's. So we tested our effects here in this adequately powered trial with linear mixed effects regression models with planned contrasts at 6, 12, and 18 months. And we found a significant decrease at 6 and 18-month follow-up, which was statistically significant in favor of the 3 M's. Also, again, in terms of clinical relevance, just like in our pilot, we found that hemoglobin A1C decreased by 0.74% at the 18-month follow-up in the 3 M's group, which is clinically meaningful in addition to statistically significant. Now, again, if you were listening before, I said that the recommended range of A1C is 7.5%. And so these kids by no means with this intervention moved into optimal glycemic control, but you can see that the intervention is helping them at least shift in that direction. And we were happy with that given that this is a light, easy to deliver intervention. I'll say a little bit about dose, because again, that's something that we've been talking about in this presentation. The dose was evenly distributed in the intervention. About 1/3 of the families got 1, 2, or 3 sessions. We did look to see if dose received made a difference in terms of the health outcome, and the findings were a little mixed in this regard, but overall there was some indication that getting more sessions of the 3 M's made a difference. So when we compared the outcomes for youth whose caregiver got 1 session versus more than 1 session, there was a difference in favor of the more reduction in A1C for the youth whose caregivers received more than 1 session at the 18-month point. Finally, I just want to share a little bit about barriers and facilitators from the standpoint of healthcare providers. So when we first started talking about Orbit, I said, hey, it's really important early on to think about the end user. And here's something that I would probably do differently if I were to do it again. So as I discussed, we spent a lot of time working carefully with the parents around the intervention, but it wasn't until our phase 3 trial that we gathered data directly from healthcare providers. That's because we had clinicians as part of our research development team, but in this phase 3 study, we did gather data from a number of healthcare providers in the 7 clinics where we delivered the intervention. We got data from physicians, but also from other members of the healthcare team. And in diabetes clinics, there's usually a multidisciplinary clinic team, including dietitians, nurse practitioners, and psychologists. So we did have some of each of those. And if you look at this, what you can see is that we had a number of positives or facilitators reported. So the kinds of things that we were told in our qualitative interviews was that the intervention did match to most of the providers' ideas about the importance of family management and involving parents in the management of adolescents. So that was a good fit. Several providers also talked about it was a fit with the institution demands or expectations. So these were children's hospitals, and it matched the values of children's hospitals for family-centered care. Also demands that were being placed on them for standardization of care. So they saw an eHealth intervention that was standardized as a good fit for that. But on the other hand, interestingly, despite developing a brief eHealth intervention, healthcare providers also perceived some pretty typical barriers. Those include included concerns about a lack of space to deliver the intervention, or concerns about privacy if an iPad was handed out in the waiting room, concerns about technology, maybe we don't even have an iPad, workflow, that perhaps if the provider wanted to see the parent when they were using the intervention, that would disrupt their work, and then concerns about who would deliver the intervention. So they provided us with a number of suggestions, including, why don't you just deliver the intervention at home, with the idea that that would not, in fact, interfere with their care in any way. So to summarize our phase 3 findings, a brief culturally tailored eHealth intervention was successful in improving glycemic control for Black adolescents. Delivery to this population during diabetes clinic visits was feasible. And that's important because it improves provision of integrated behavioral health services to Black adolescents. But healthcare providers did have some reservations about whether this was the best place to deliver the intervention, and whether there would be barriers if this were delivered in the real world. And so that leads me to the end of my talk. So our next stage here will be a phase 4 effectiveness trial, now that we do have efficacy data. And so we're interested in successfully scaling up the implementation of the intervention in real world conditions. And so now, of course, we have to think about what will that look like and what will be the best way to accomplish that. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to present our work to you, and I'm happy to take questions about our work. Thank you.